human capital is a fundamental driver of economic growth. So reducing the levels of human capital for countries that already were struggling with having sustained reasonable levels of growth is really, really a problem.
Hello everyone and welcome to Expert Answers. I'm Srimati Sridhar with the World Bank. On this episode, we're looking at one of our newest reports, Collapse and Recovery, how COVID-19 eroded human capital and what to do about it. You'll notice I'm on a playground right now, and that's because this report really looks at the severe extent to which the pandemic has impacted children and young people under the age of 25. Now, kids may be back at school, but this doesn't necessarily mean things are back on track, especially in the developing world. Norbert Shady, who is the World Bank Group's chief economist for human development and one of the report co-authors, joins me to explain more. Let's take a look at what he had to say. Norbert, first off, I want to thank you so much for joining me here on Expert Answers today on a very beautiful day. And we're lucky enough to be at an early childhood development center to talk about this report that you've co-authored. It's called Collapse and Recovery. And before we get into the specifics of it, it talks about the effects that the pandemic has had on this thing called human capital. Can you tell me what is human capital and why is it so important?
Human capital is what some people refer to as wealth embodied in people. And what I mean by that is it's the characteristics, the things that people have acquired, especially in their early years, that make them more productive later on. It really embodies a lot of different components of the skills that people have. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, it's the learning they've acquired over time, but it's also things like their health status that makes them be able to be more productive. It's their socio-emotional development, so what we call emotional intelligence. All of these things together are what people call human capital. In that sense, I want to describe three things that are particular about the way in which human capital accumulates, which are really worth keeping in mind when you think about what did the pandemic do. The first is that human capital is cumulative, or the way in which it accumulates is sequential, and what happens at one stage in the life cycle builds on what happened before and in turn affects what happens later on. So you can't really take a particular chunk out of the life cycle or a particular couple of years out of the life cycle, see what happened to these people without really understanding what happened before and after. The second thing is that the rate at which human capital accumulates is much steeper, if you want, early on in a person's life than later on when they're primarily working or eventually are in old age. So these two characteristics, and the fact that also that human capital is multidimensional, that it's really this integral process, makes it different from other forms of capital, and makes it particularly important that we look at the effects the pandemic had at the first, if you want, quarter century or so of a person's life, which is when human capital accumulates most rapidly.
So, Norbert, let's talk specifically about the developmental stages, because this report really is a comprehensive analysis of global data for, like you said, people under the age of 25. And I believe you identify three critical life stages. Can you talk more about those and how the pandemic has impacted each one?
What we do is we first look at children who are of an age before they enter formal schooling in most countries. So these are children 5 and under. Then we look at children who are school-aged at a time when most are not yet considering working. And so we look at children between the ages of 6 and 14. And then we look at youth, individuals between the ages of 15 and 24, which is the point in time at which individuals are either entering the labor market or making decisions about whether to continue their schooling. So first, looking at individuals between the ages of 0 and 5, what we do there is, in some sense, we look at children under the age of 3 or under and those who are 4 and 5, because the kinds of services that governments provide generally are quite different for 3 and under year olds and 4 and 5 year olds. But what we show is, regardless of the age, what we show is that there were serious declines in immunization coverage. There were increases in food insecurity, and here's where the age distinction comes into play. For 4 and 5 year olds, where a substantial proportion of them are enrolled in preschool, in particular in middle income countries, preschools shut down for inordinately long periods of time, so these children were kind of locked out of school, literally. And I say this distinction is important because in most developing countries, the coverage of preschool or daycare for 0 to 3-year-olds is very low. So we see this sort of shutdown of critical services that these young kids need, and perhaps not surprisingly, we see these alarming declines in child development. And I just want to give one example, which refers to cognitive development. Cognitive development is very highly predictive of how well these children do eventually in school and even later in the labor market. In Bangladesh, data that we collected for this report, we compare a cohort of children who were roughly 2 years of age in 2019 before the pandemic hit, and then we went back to those same villages and collect the data on a new cohort of children, also 24 months of age or so, in 2022. And what we find is these alarming declines in child cognition, in child cognitive development. Declines that we know, contrary to what is popular perception, these children are not going to make up on their own. So it really is a very serious concern, what happened to young children, and one that has been underemphasized in the policy dialogue, I think. Then we go to school-age children, and what we show there is that in developing countries, roughly 1 billion children. This is not 1 million. This is 1 billion. It's very rare to be talking about billions of people being affected by something. This is 1 billion children in developing countries missed a year of school or more. Despite widespread efforts by governments everywhere to put in place some form of remote instruction or hybrid schooling, the average child learned close to nothing during the time that they missed schooling. Actually, if you want, unlearned some of what they already knew. And what I mean by that is you can imagine a girl who perhaps was 10 years old when the pandemic hit, who knew how to add and subtract and was meant to learn how to multiply and divide thereafter. So not only did she not learn how to multiply and divide because schools were closed and the remote instruction didn't work, but she actually forgot how to add and subtract. Because this is a cumulative process, it's not like, oh, well, they didn't learn that, so let's just move on and they can learn the next one. If you don't know how to divide, you're not going to be doing higher level math, obviously. So this is really a critical finding as well. Finally, when we look at young people, what we find is large declines in their labor force participation, and large declines also in various other indicators of job quality, for example, wages. Now, one might say, well, this wouldn't be a problem if these individuals who normally would have gone to work are now going into school, but we don't find that by and large. So there are a lot more, if you want, NEETs. NEETs are individuals who are neither in employment or education or training. If you want, idle youth. There are more NEETs throughout the world as a result of the pandemic. For example, in Pakistan alone, we estimate that an additional 1.6 million youth are NEETs who would not, in the absence of the pandemic, have been this. Where we also find that the recovery post, if you want, the most acute phase of the pandemic has been very uneven. In some countries, we do see a recovery in youth employment, and in many countries, we don't.
So the impact of the pandemic, obviously far-reaching and global, but you really focus on developing countries here. Tell me more about how developing countries have been uniquely impacted by the pandemic, and what are the implications really when you think about poverty?
I mean, we know, for example, that in terms of economic recovery and in terms of the recovery of overall employment, the recovery in developing countries has been slower. There are a variety of reasons for that, including the ability of richer countries to invest more to recover the economy. But moreover, almost consistently, the levels of human capital in these countries are much lower than those in developed countries. The years of schooling and how much kids learn in school are obviously very different if you're looking at Finland and you say, well, let's look at what the levels of human capital were, even in the absence of the pandemic, were in, say, Chad. We're talking about radical differences.
Of course.
Having even further declines of human capital in these countries where human capital was already very low to begin with is really particularly alarming. Human capital is a fundamental driver of economic growth. So reducing the levels of human capital for countries that already were struggling with having a sustained, reasonable level of growth is really, really a problem. And that all sounds kind of abstract, but if you take it one level down and you go down now to what it means for individual people, it means we estimate that the declines in human capital amongst people in developing countries could lead to, if unremedied, could lead to declines in their lifetime earnings of between 10 and 20%. Now this is really serious. In the bomb we use the word a ticking time bomb, because in a way this is going to take some time to work its way through, if you want, as these kids age. The cohorts that were most affected by the pandemic are going to be 90% of the prime age workforce in 2050. Not only that, the impacts are largest for those who are already poorest to begin with, so children or young people whose parents had low levels of education. So we're saying that we're already living through an age, as many have pointed out, in which inequality has been rising dramatically for a variety of reasons, and public policy has been struggling to address that in both wealthy countries as well as lower income countries. Now we're saying we've kind of turbocharged that. So these are really, they're concerns, obviously the effects of the pandemic are concerns for both developed and developing countries, but I think they're particularly dire for developing countries, and particularly dire also because they have the fewest resources to really address this in the short term.
Yeah, and I mean, just that idea of a ticking time bomb, it's like the time to act really is now, right? We can't really wait to fix this. So speaking of that, you've really laid out the scale of the problem here, Norbert. So how do we fix this? You know, what can we do, and what can countries do you think, in the long term to better prepare against future crises?
We divide the policy responses into, if you want, two groups. One are things that countries should do right away to try to recover some of this human capital, and the other is sort of systemic changes that they should begin now to prepare for crises in the future. The window of opportunity to revert some of these shortfalls is short, and that sounds kind of redundant, but it really is so. And the reason is, if kids come back to school, just to use that example, and they don't understand anything that's happening, and 6 months later they still don't understand anything that's happening, well, they're not going to stick around school forever. So we are perpetuating the problem, making it worse. These kids are going to drop out of school. So a really important point we make, and then I'll give you some specific examples, is that, you know, we used to be on a trajectory of human capital, if you want, that rose steeply and then more gently, and just to get back to a parallel trajectory, so lower but parallel to that, requires serious investments. Because if we don't do anything, what the default, if you want, is not just that they don't make that up, but they keep on falling further and further behind. So just to, like I said, have lower levels of human capital, but levels of human capital that are not declining more in the future, already requires a concerted effort by governments. To get to a trajectory that puts you back where you were before requires very serious effort and very serious policy attention by governments. It means that for every year now, we need to put in place policies that allow individuals to learn more, if you want, while they're in school, or have higher growth rates in their child development when they're younger than they did before. So this is really, really a tall order for countries. And so one of the pieces of advice we give governments is rethink your curriculum, your school curriculum. School curricula are already overburdened, if you want, in many developing countries. And this is the time to particularly prioritize those skills that if you don't pick up now, you really aren't going to pick up later, and that are going to determine what happens to you in your life for a long time. And the critical thing about this example is that actually doesn't cost a lot of money. It's an issue of political will, sort of saying, okay, this is important, we're going to do it. And it's an issue of, if you want, implementation capacity to actually make that happen. But there's a second basket of interventions that are not specific to each sector. And let me give you a little bit of background on that. Governments who responded well were able to, in some cases, expand the coverage of existing programs, either increase the number of people who are in them or increase the intensity of those programs. And that sounds a little bit vague, so let me give you an example. Many countries had cash transfer programs in place. So they were either able to increase the amount given to existing households in the cash transfer program to protect them against the shock, or increase the coverage, so bring in additional households who normally would not have been in the program. So there were responses that governments took that were somewhat effective, as best they could. They took these, But they were responses by and large, with very few exceptions. They were responses that actually affected only one program or at best one ministry. And so where we find the biggest, if you want, shortages or the biggest limitations of government responses was in the ability to coordinate these different investments and to rethink them as more data came in from the pandemic. But countries that had been faced with something like this before were better able to resolve those coordination problems and those, if you want, that necessity to resolve trade-offs. And I'm going to give you two examples, sort of, if you want, at different ends of the income spectrum. One example comes from West Africa. And these are countries that were sadly suffered from the Ebola epidemic in 2014. In 2014, they responded as best they could. It was an unexpected, dramatic shock. They shut down schools. There was a public health emergency. All of these things that we see now in the pandemic happened to some extent in these countries. And as a result, they were able to learn from that, and they were more effective at responding to the pandemic than other countries of similar or even higher income levels who hadn't been faced with a shock like that. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have a country like Finland, where there is a body of high-level government authorities and experts who meet once a month in order to, if you want, game out how to respond to a particular kind of national shock. So it could be something like there is no power in the country for 3 days. It could be something like there is a pandemic. And every month they meet, and on the basis of that, they have recommendations to the higher levels of government. And look, if you really want to prepare for the next aggregate shock, you need to think about this, and you should do this. For example, stock up on face masks and things like that. So at both ends of the spectrum, there really is an ability to really learn from the current pandemic. We all want to just put it behind us and think about something else. But I think that would be a mistake. And I think this is the opportunity to learn about how better to coordinate these investments in the future to make sure that the countries are in a better position to respond to future shocks, be they a climate shock, a war, a famine, or God hope not, another pandemic.
So Norbert, we've talked about some pretty heavy issues here. So I do want to end this on a bit more of a personal note. For someone like yourself who's been so heavily involved with this research and this report, what really resonated with you, and what kind of leaves you feeling hopeful, regardless of kind of what we've talked about here today?
So one thing that resonated with me, Sri, very deeply is the fact that the effects of the pandemic on human capital were, regardless of the age group, regardless of the outcome, regardless of the country, were invariably worse for households with fewer resources. And I want to share just one anecdote. A couple of years ago, I was traveling in Peru, in northern Peru with my family, and I remember seeing waves of Venezuelan refugees that were streaming across the border into Peru. And these were people who had left everything behind, who just were walking, northern Peru, this is through a desert. They were walking on the Pan American Highway, the main highway, with nothing, with young children, whatever, and you sort of sit there and think, to see that people like these, or other people, like these poor people, who really had so little to begin with, that they've been deprived of sort of these critical investments that would have allowed them to aspire to a better life. We do have interventions that we know actually can make a difference at this juncture. We have interventions in education, we have interventions in health, we have interventions in nutrition, in social protection, that have been tried in many countries. Right. It's a situation where this was terrible, it continues to be terrible, and it's important to remind decision makers of that, but there are things we can do to at least partly, hopefully fully, redress some of these costs to those who are most vulnerable in the developing world.
Well, on that note, Norbert, I want to thank you again so much for joining me here on Expert Answers to talk more about the report, Collapse and Recovery. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sri.
Collapse and Recovery, How COVID-19 Eroded Human Capital and What to Do About It is out now, available on our website at www.worldbank.org. so make sure to head on over and grab your own copy. That's it for this episode of Expert Answers. I'm Srimati Sridhar, and I'll see you next time.